Hello and welcome to Security Scan, a program that provides an informed Indian perspective on security developments across the world. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week, we look at the G20 summit that concluded recently in China. The final summit document reaffirmed the group's resolve to continue the fight against terror. But will such proclamations serve any purpose? What needs to be done to achieve tangible results in the global effort against terror? For India, it may be recalled, this proxy war began in the late 1980s. To discuss this, we have Ambassador Vivek Katju, a seasoned diplomat. Welcome, Vivek. And Lieutenant General Hasnain, a former GOC of the 15 Corps in Srinagar. Both of them are experts who have dealt with the issue of terrorism in different ways. Let me turn to you first, Ambassador Katju. The G20 summit and the current global focus on terrorism, what do you make of it? Are we going anywhere, or is it only rich in rhetoric?
No, I think there has been an improvement in certain areas in the fight against terror. For instance, there is a greater awareness that the financing of terror has to be staunched, if not eliminated completely. And the Financial Action Task Force, of which India is a member now, has been directed to achieve this purpose. Then there is greater intelligence sharing on a selective basis among intelligence agencies worldwide. But yet there is a basic problem, which is perhaps natural, in the sense that different countries are focused on different aspects of terror or terror emanating from specific groups. For example, India is more concerned with terror which is emanating from Pakistan, and this is natural for us. Whereas the Americans are more fixated on the groups which have targeted the American mainland. Therefore, I think there is the need for a greater cohesiveness in the battle against terror. And one indication of achieving that greater cohesiveness will be when the world is able to adopt the comprehensive Convention against International Terrorism, which India championed and proposed to the UN 20 years ago, in 1996.
And we have made no headway.
No, well, we made some headway, but it's still stuck in some definitional issues relating to who is a terrorist.
But this is an issue that Prime Minister Modi has been flagging every forum that he has addressed so far. But Atta, when we talk about terrorism and politics, whether at the global level, the regional level, or even in the domestic context of India, Prime Minister Modi at the G20 had encouraged the members to go beyond politics and have the equivalent of a consensus against terror. How feasible is that?
Well, I would go along with what Mr. Katju just said, that the whole issue now is actually based upon local interests more than international interests. Actually, the international concern against terrorism really came into being with the launch on the global war on terror in 2001, if you remember. At the beginning, it was primarily the focus on Afghanistan, the focus on Al-Qaeda and nothing else. Thereafter, of course, it's proliferated around the world. The international threats from terrorism are there. So we have found that in the last 10, 12 or 15 years, all that has happened is local interests have come into prominence. How to put this entire thing together, how to actually justify an action, coordinated action at the international level, can only be done, I think, by a single agency, and that is the United Nations, which is chartered to do a thing like this. And India has been championing this for the last 20 years, as you're aware. What's happened in Beijing is definitely a good indication. The fact that it's been included in the final declaration, a mention on international terrorism, global terrorism has been mentioned. Mr. Modi's intervention was a significant one. The only thing was that the response from the rest of the 19 nations wasn't as, may I say, energetic as what the manner in which Mr. Modi put it across. And obviously, India being the focus, have been the longest sufferers of international terror. I think we are the ones who need to take the lead wherever we can. We've got various summits coming up, and in those summits, perhaps it will take the lead.
But if I could play devil's advocate here, Vivek, you have dealt with this issue for many years from the Ministry of External Affairs as the Joint Secretary looking after Pakistan. Now, Atta suggests that the UN is the best forum. But my response is that when you have both the United States and China in the Security Council, and they, for political reasons, are willing to turn a blind eye against Pakistan's action, and this was a very interesting departure by Prime Minister Modi at the G20 in China, where he actually, short of naming them, said that these countries must desist from what they're doing. So how do you look at this change in the Indian position?
No, I think we are being more forceful in pointing out to the international community that we are suffering from Pakistani terror. And the Prime Minister did extremely well in putting it so squarely. Of course, the context was the financing of terror. And he was perfectly within his rights to take the position that he did. One should not expect that there will be a very enthusiastic response to this, initially at least from the international community, because in respect of Pakistan, they have vested interests. What did the Prime Minister say? He said that such countries should be sanctioned. They should be isolated and not rewarded.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you see the entire focus of America and the West has been on engaging Pakistan. So, here is the Indian Prime Minister saying that, look, you can't have double speak, you can't have double standards. Isolate a country which is practicing terror in one part of the world and engaging a country in another part of the world. Imposing sanctions on someone and not imposing sanctions on the other. There has to be a certain consistency, which of course will bring us perhaps later in the program, if you so decide, on what should India's policy be now, in concrete terms.
We'll come to that in a moment, but if I could just come back again, I think, to this issue that we flagged. Atha, you were suggesting that today most of the challenges are local. But in the Southern Asian context, or perhaps you say West Asian context, there is this challenge that we now associate with the Islamic State. But when the war against terror started, we spoke about the Al-Qaeda. We in India have our own experience, whether it's the Lashkar or clones of the same ideology. So where do you locate this whole challenge of ideology associated with the distortion of the tenets of Islam?
Well, it's a much larger, this aspect is a much larger issue. It's not a local issue, although it manifests locally in different ways. For example, what's happening in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Bali, or places like that, has different connotations than what is happening in South Asia, in Bangladesh, or what's happening in West Asia. There's no doubt that Islamic radicalism has come to the fore in the last 20 years or so. It is the driving force of international terrorism, global terrorism. It is coming out from in different ways in West Asia and in South Asia. I think ultimately what has to be done is the dilution of the ideology. That's not an easy way of doing it. There's no shortcuts to it immediately. Mr. Katju has suggested that the aspects of financing, the aspects of intelligence, all these play a major role, of course. But the ultimate thing is this sensitization, the aspect of understanding which way Islam is actually going. The way I understand it is that Islam is actually undergoing a churning, and that it is going a reformation, and it's going to take a long time to ultimately reform itself. How are we going to contain the manifestation of the initial stages of this journey is what the challenge is for the world today.
If we could now move to the Indian context, Vivek, just to pick up this thread that Atha mentioned, if I were to take the liberty of saying that this particular ideology, perhaps it could be described as the extension of the Sunni, Wahhabi, Salafi spectrum in terms of how the politics is now being driven. In India, you've been watching Kashmir very closely. You're familiar with the state and its dynamic. The current situation and the challenge of terror, which, as I often say, is more than 25 years old, it goes back to 89, 90. How would you, first of all, assess the challenge and what is the way ahead?
Look, let me pick up the threads from what Atta has said. In the Indian context, I think there were different Islamic mazhabs which had become indigenous to India. They had elements of accommodativeness given our local situation. They were at peace, theologically at peace. Now the challenge which has come has been theological in the first place from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, where forms of Islam which were indigenous to these areas have projected themselves as universalist. That has led to a dilution in the indigenous mazhabs which were there. And the tragedy is that there hasn't been enough combating by the indigenous upholders of the indigenous mazhabs to these challenges which have emanated from the peninsula, bringing these sharper forms of Islam which grew in isolation, which were not part of a pluralist tradition as they were, say, in India. And these, backed with money, they have gone forth. I think it's a fact, they've been backed with money. Now, the same challenge is there in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where there was an indigenous form of Islam.
Which was tolerant in terms of its
Which was tolerant,
texture.
which was part of, which was part of an old tradition which was rooted in the soil of Kashmir. And there was great pride in this. Among, I think, the Muslims of Kashmir, there was great pride.
The Kashmiriyat that is often
The
referred to.
Kashmiriyat, as it's called. But that has been under challenge for decades now. And I don't think that the upholders of Kashmiriyat have combated it theologically sufficiently. With the result that you have the sharper forms not only creeping in, but in some cases almost taking over. And today I think the time has come, and this has nothing to do with the state, but the time has come when the upholders of the old tradition must, at some risk, because it will be risky, but stand up and assert themselves that this is not what Islam is all about.
But we recall that in the 90s, Atta, you are familiar, you served there. Whenever these voices, the moderate voices, those that were espousing Kashmiriyat, they were eliminated ruthlessly. We remember the senior Mirwais. But having served there as the GOC, this whole question of the spiritual dimension or the theology that is distinctive to the valley, do you think there is a case to try and focus on that and revive it?
I think, taking a cue from what Mr. Katju just said, absolutely correct. It's not Kashmiriyat, it's not the aspect of Islam in Kashmir alone, it's the aspect of Islam all over South Asia. I was in Bangladesh and I remember many people in Bangladesh telling me, our Islam is Sufi Islam. Similarly, it was so in Pakistan. Something turned around in Pakistan around 1977, 78, 79. Just around the time when the Iranian Revolution took place and you found the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan taking place, that is the time when actually you can take back what's happening today to that period. And it was very clear that Pakistan, for retribution against India and what happened in Bangladesh and East Pakistan, was strike hard, strike where India was weak, and that was considered to be Kashmir. And they always felt that it was the fault lines in India which could be exploited. And these fault lines could be exploited if you brought in a different form of Islam, the Arabized form of Islam. That would take Pakistan closer to Saudi Arabia. The financing would come from Saudi Arabia, and automatically this would flow into Kashmir and to the rest of India. We should not look at it alone as Kashmir. I think this whole plan was for the whole of India. Now, in Kashmir itself, I remember through the 90s and the parts of the millennium, there has been a slow growth process of a number of mosques in Kashmir turning around, and you found many of the typical Sufi mosques transforming into Wahhabi mosques. And you find the replacement of many of Kashmir's, the Kashmir Maulvis all being turned over by Maulvis coming from UP, East UP, Bihar and places like that. And you found the slow creeping influence of Wahhabiyat. This happened under our noses. We were aware of it. The unfortunate thing is that in India, I think we did not understand the strength of radicalization and how much of a difference it can make. That realization has come today. We are still slow to reacting and responding to it, but we are responding today. Much more education among the security agencies, the intelligence agencies will have to be done before we actually go into a war mode against the entire concept of
You want to come in?
I wanted to make 2 points. It was not only in the Indian subcontinent, it was even in Afghanistan. You will find this interesting. I recollect having a discussion with Ahmad Shah Massoud once about the theological underpinnings of the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. And he was a very, very pious Muslim. He told me that he didn't understand the theologies of the Taliban. He said, I don't know what kind of Islam are they talking about. Now, the second point.
And an Afghan himself.
And one of the great leaders of the Afghan Jihad, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Now, the second point is that I think, why did we allow it to grow under our noses? And this is where the Indian state, because of this debate between secularism and communalism, found it very difficult to intervene in these processes. I think that was a mistake. Because the state didn't want to appear to say that, look, what's happening here is going to be harmful not only to the national interest but also to the particular interests of the Indian Muslim community. But still, because of the fear that it will be dubbed as communal and that you are interfering in these processes, which are private, group processes, it refrained. And today we are paying a price for this.
But there's a historical context, Ata, from what you were saying. It really goes back to the mid-70s, meaning first you have the oil price hike, which introduces the petrodollar concept, meaning that these oil exporting countries led by Saudi Arabia become fiscally more, shall we say, capable. And then you have the tectonic shift of 1979, the Iranian Revolution, and the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, all of which culminate. But Vivek, I want to come back to another point for you.
One other point there. It was also the attack
on the Holy Mosque.
On the mosque.
So, you have the equivalent
of
the petrodollar, the militancy that we see associated with the Holy Mosque, as also the Shia-Sunni tension. And gradually, I think the point you make about the Wahhabization of the practice of Islam, and that is being contested now, who is a good Muslim and how.
If I may add one thing here, please. Just a small thing. I think the landmark of the 1979 revolution in Iran was a very, very important landmark, because that sent out signals, threat signals to Saudi Arabia, that their form of Wahhabiyat would be under threat from Iran, the Persian civilization. And they went whole hog. Absolutely. In fact, energized their entire concept, financing it internationally. And one of the areas they chose for incubation of the whole ideology was Pakistan.
And again, I think, Vivek, since you made this point, I just want to flag it, saying that regrettably, the way in which I think the Indian political, shall we say, dynamic had evolved, going back to the mid-70s, we're talking about Mrs. Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister to now, each time I think it was a short-term gain that was prioritized, whether we talk about the national level or the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But I want to shift gears to you, Vivek, because you are, more, shall we say, au fait with these matters. Prime Minister Modi has, as you said, very squarely this time, identified the contour of the problem, in which, short of naming these two countries, Pakistan and China, and the growing alliance between them, it has been there for a very long time. See as the diplomatic challenge and the way ahead, now that China and Pakistan are in the kind of strategic embrace that they are, how will it play out in relation to terrorism?
Look, I think the bottom line is that by the Prime Minister, by raising the Pakistan terrorism nexus at the G20, has flagged both to Pakistan and, more importantly, to the international community, that Pakistan will not have impunity as before in throwing terrorism at India, that India will combat it, and that the specific message to the Chinese, if at least the subtext of that message is that whatever may be their relationship with Pakistan, if Indian interests are threatened by this nexus, then India will safeguard its interests. Now, this is at the conceptual stage, and he's articulated this. We've now got to demonstrate that through action, through diplomatic action. I'm not suggesting anything adventurous, but that diplomatic action now has to follow. Otherwise, there will be a dichotomy between what we are saying and what we are doing. If, for instance, the Prime Minister says that such countries as Pakistan, who are throwing terrorism at the world and in South Asia, should be sanctioned and isolated.
So that is the line
Now-
that we should be.
Now, the next question is, how will you do this yourself? Leave alone the international community. Let's keep that apart. How will you do so yourself? Will there be a course correction to our Pakistan policy? Which is needed if you are going to say that this is...
Which perhaps we may see at the UNGA when it opens in mid-September.
Not only in the UNGA, but also in the bilateral context, it will have to be demonstrated.
But again, Atta, if I can turn from what Vivek said just now, Pakistan has been exporting terror. India is not the only destination. Afghanistan has also been an affected party. The president of Afghanistan has repeatedly now in recent months drawn attention to this. So in terms of the new policy orientation, how would you sort of appreciate, or what is your appreciation of Afghanistan in relation to India's course correction on regional policies?
Much more cooperation, there's no doubt about it. And I take a cue from what Mr. Modi actually said on Independence Day, 15th of August. I think that level of proactiveness in Indian policy appears to be emerging. I think Mr. Modi, by making that statement on Balochistan, on Gilgit-Baltistan and on POK, was actually testing the waters. It's after a long time that anyone as a head of government in India actually has gone proactive to test the waters. There's been a tremendous response to it. You've seen the instigation which has happened in Washington, a lot of Baluchi leaders writing about it, and the intellectual world seems to be agog with it. Now the question, the test ultimately is how to take this forward. It's an important aspect because quid pro quo, two can play this game. This has to be the policy which needs to be clearly and squarely told to the Pakistanis. I think only then this understanding will start emerging from it.
Vivek, on Balochistan, since you were the point man for many years, a quick observation?
No, I think, look, the Prime Minister nuanced his statement very well. He put it in the context of human rights. And that is the path to pursue. Keep focusing on human rights.
And flag that.
Flag it. Ask why is the Baluch so discontented? Why is this a fifth rebellion or fifth insurgency in Balochistan?
Put the spotlight on Balochistan.
Put the spotlight on Balochistan squarely. That's the way to proceed, which is perfectly fine diplomatically.
Terrorism presents a very complex and contradictory pattern. 15 years ago, on September 11th, 2001, the global community became aware of the destructive capacity of the non-state entity. In the intervening years, the response to terror has become more professional, and states working individually and collectively have been reasonably successful in containing these extreme elements. Yet, state support to the ideology that drives terror needs a certain kind of political commitment. This was what Prime Minister Modi sought at the G20 summit when he said, quote, "Those who sponsor and support terrorism must be isolated and sanctioned, not rewarded," unquote. The subtext is clear. Rhetoric must be complemented by earnest action. On that note, allow me to thank my guests. Ambassador Katju, General Hasnain, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And thank you for watching Security Scan.